This is a presentation of the Freedom Committee of Orange County, a 5C3 nonprofit corporation composed of veterans from all the wars, from World War II through the Gulf Wars. Our mission is to pass the torch of freedom to future generations. And we do that by going into the schools, elementary, high school, and colleges, and tell our stories to the students. And a couple of years ago, we surpassed a milestone of over 100,000 students engaged. You can find more information about us on our website, fc-oc.org. This is my story. My name is William J. Mull, Jr., a retired United States Air Force Major General. I was the Air Component Commander for the mission Urgent Fury, the invasion of Grenada. I have to set this in a little historical context. This was at the heart of the Cold War. The invasion of Grenada occurred in October of 1983, almost 20 years to the day from when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. During the invasion of Grenada, the president was Ronald Reagan. In March of 1983, President Reagan, using a national televised event, broadcast a warning to certain elements in the Caribbean, communist elements that were on the island of Grenada, and they were constructing a huge runway. These units were from Cuba. They were Cuban military personnel constructing a runway. And he saw that as a threat to our hemisphere. And being a student of history and remembering how close we came to war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he proceeded to warn those communist organizations to cease and desist the building of a military base in Grenada. That happened in March. About that same time, I was commander of combat rescue forces. Those were the guys during the Vietnam War that went down on a cable from a helicopter, rescued down pilots. And during civilian times, we continued the mission of rescuing civilians, lost hikers, downed pilots, national disasters, and so forth. We averaged about 2,000 saves a year. And about this time, the Air Force decided to consolidate all of their helicopter units and their special forces with the rescue forces. So we formed a unit called 23rd Air Force, and I was the first commander of 23rd Air Force. So during this same period, 1983, I was consolidating this huge acquisition of forces, looking at missions that overlapped and missions that were duplicated, and flying with the newly formed units, getting to know their commanders and so forth. So it was a busy summer for me prior to the invasion of Grenada, consolidating these forces. This emblem shows you exactly what our mission was. It was a global mission. You see the two stripes on one side, three on the other for 23rd, and the globe in daylight and night. We were the leading units with night vision technology. We led the Air Force and the nation with that. We were the first to develop night vision technique, and we used this technology for our night operations, which was critical for special operations. So this was a global command. Now I had 15,000 people in my command. We had troops in South Korea, the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, Alaska, all across the northern tier of the U.S. at Strategic Air Command bases. We had units in Panama, the United Kingdom, Spain, Germany, and Turkey. So it was a busy summer for me, getting all these units evaluated and consolidated under one umbrella, so to speak. During October, I decided to take a vacation. Took the family down to Charleston, South Carolina, when my son was enrolled into Citadel at college down there. And I had an able number 2 guy, my vice commander, a 1-star. I passed the flag to him. And as a commander of a combat unit, however, and this, keep in mind, was before we had cell phones and so forth, I had to post my itinerary at the nearest Air Force base of where I would be in case I was needed for anything, even though I had a capable guy running the operation while it was on vacation. And I gave that itinerary to the Charleston Air Force Base Command Center. And I was sitting at a football game then at the Citadel with the family, enjoying a nice October day, when we noticed a Air Force major walking along. But it's a small stadium. It wasn't like anything in the Big Ten or anything. It was just an intimate group of people. And the wife said, "That guy's looking for you. Why don't you help him out?" So I gave him a wave, and he came up and he said, "Yeah, Major General Mall, we got a classified message for you at the command post. I can drive you over there and let you read it." And I thought that was unusual to pull me out of there, but that's the way it went. So I started down the stadium stairs, and I thought, I'd better leave the wife the keys to the rental car. We'd flown down there commercial, and I'd rented a place out in one of the barrier islands. So I gave her the keys in the rental car, hopped in a car with a guy, went over to base ops and into the command center. And my 4-star boss was on the phone, and he said, "There's something going on in the Caribbean." He said, "I want you to be attuned to that and find out what it is." And the operation was going to be conducted under the command of an Army general, the commander of the Joint Special Operations Command. This was a new technique. Usually each force, Air Force, Navy, and Marines, they fought their own war with their own commanders. And this was the first time we were going to consolidate under one officer, and that happened to be at this time an Army officer. And there was a little bit of distrust at the 4-star level among the different services. My commander boss was concerned that this Army general would be able to understand the limitations of air power and the effects of weather and crew duty time and so forth. He said, "I want you to just go up to Fort Bragg and make sure what they're planning doesn't involve any kind of stress on our assets that we can't handle. In other words, keep a lookout for our troops." Now I was faced with a problem. He said, "Look outside the window," and out there was a 4-engine C-141 Starlifter ready to take me up to Fort Bragg. So I hopped on that airplane, went up there, and we're into the compound where the Special Operations Forces were formed. And my vice commander, my 1-star vice commander, had already positioned planning operation consisting of 2 helicopter trained planners and 2 fixed-wing planners. And after I got into the compound, got checked through, it was pretty difficult because I'm civilian clothes, and they had to come out and vouch for me and everything. And this was a pretty well-regarded security organization up there, and it took a while just to clear me into the place. The event was to take place on the island of Grenada, the operation. To give you an idea where it is, you see the tip of Florida here in Cuba, of course, maintained by Fidel Castro at the time. Grenada's all the way down at the end of the westward Antilles, right off the coast of Venezuela. So I had no idea where it was. I remembered the president talking about it. My planning staff then briefed me. We had 300 American medical students on the island of Grenada. And it was the tasking for us to get them out of there. The island of Grenada was under a lot of stress. There was an insurrection going on. Although they had a parliamentary democracy, they had an insurgency that was pushing them more and more in the direction of communism. And the situation was identified as being a threat to our students there. So the object was, let's get 300 students out of there. And our units were tasked to do that. We had all along through the Cold War been using our helicopters and our forces to insert and extract people from behind Iron Curtain countries, Middle Eastern countries, and so forth. So we were pretty well adept at doing that, except that this was an unusual number. To get 300 out of there, it was going to take quite an effort. And what we were planning on using was our heavy lift helicopter, the HH-53, still in service with the Marines, incidentally. Normally held about 20 to 30 fully armed and outfitted tactical troops. We figured we could foil these students. We knew practically where all of them were billeted. And the object then was to lower the ramp in the back of this thing, and the first row of people would get in up against the bulkhead. The next group would sit on the floor right behind them, spread their legs, or reach around the chest of the person in front of them, and you could pack 50 to 60 into this airplane, and that's what we call a floor load. You can see it's got air refueling capability with the boom in the front, and looked like a pretty simple mission for us. We had the assets available out of our bases down in Panama. The only question was if we could get a Navy flat top helicopter ship up there, we could shorten the number of trips and assets and get them out a lot quicker. The plan was to go in with a bunch of SEAL Team 6 and tell the force, set up a perimeter in case anybody was disagreeing with what we were doing. Go into the billeted area where they were, the dormitories, load them all up and move them out, either the flat top or get an air refueling all the way back to Panama, get them out. This was a Saturday afternoon. It was set for Tuesday morning. I called my boss. I said, this thing's under control, not a problem. We can do it. We just want to work out whether we can use the Navy flat top or not if there's one in the area. And I went to bed that Saturday night figuring this thing's in the bag and that boys have in hand. And I'd be back with the family probably within 24 hours. Those best laid plans, of course. This was the plan A. I got a call at 2:30 in the morning. We got revised tasking. Now we were to take the island Grenada with mission casualties, full-scale invasion. President Reagan decided that the situation had deteriorated to the point where it was a communist takeover was imminent, and that I wanted to just take the island over and remove the threat completely. So now we've got a full-scale invasion. This has gone beyond the scope of just a simple special ops operation. So now we had to plan on C-130s to bring in troopers. We were going to do an air assault on the island's main runway. The Marines simultaneously were to come across the other end of the island with an amphibious assault, and it would be a combined Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine operation. The problem is we still had a deadline of Tuesday morning, and this looked like it would be something that would take about 3 or 4 months of planning to get it done right. And you now had units coming from all over the country. It's been 10 years since the Vietnam War, and all these warriors were getting notified that there's something going on. They all wanted in on the action, and the phone was ringing off the hook. Different outfits, different organizations were being put into it by the Pentagon. And my 4 guys were trying to plan all this. They were overwhelmed. I made a call to my 4-star boss, and I said, we got to shut this thing off. We don't have the assets to go up to Rhode Island to pick up a bunch of CBs and bring them back down here. We don't have the crews to do that, or the C-130s, the cargo planes to do that. So he finally put a cap on things, but our requests for an extension, get it beyond just Tuesday morning, were turned down by the White House. They said they wanted this thing to go on Tuesday, and that was it. So we started planning on aircraft coming from 3 different locations in the U.S. for the airborne assault. The question is, we had a key decision, the Army had, rather. You're going to airdrop or air land? We're going to parachute out, or we're going to land the aircraft and let them run off? Now, despite we're in all the movies and so forth, and they have the great capability to parachute from airplanes, the Army would prefer to air land, because then all their troops are together. You may recall the movie The Longest Day, when it depicted the Normandy invasion, where they spread these troopers all over the place, and officers are separated from their enlisted men, and people get injured on airdrops. And this particular airdrop was on a landing zone, which was the runway at Port Salinas, which was surrounded on 3 sides by water. The Army would really like to air land. They could also have their mobility. They could have vehicles and so forth and heavier equipment. When you airdrop, you're restricted to the 300 pounds or so you can strap on your back. So that was the question. The problem was, during the construction of this runway, the one thing we had in intelligence that we knew, they were having a very difficult time because there was a lake on one side of the runway, the ocean on the other side, and the lake, the water was running through and kept disrupting, and the laying of the concrete and so forth. So the runway was almost cut in half by this water problem. And we didn't know if that runway would support aircraft or not. So we had to get somebody in there to do it. And the object fell to the SEAL Team 6. And they were to jump off the back of a 141 at low level, throw out a Zodiac, get onto the runway, and let us know if we could make that landing or not. This drop was sent up for Sunday night, and we got word that the mission was aborted. We had 9 SEALs jump out of the back of the airplane. They pushed the Zodiac. That's one of these rubber raft boats. There was a 40-mile-an-hour wind blowing. The boat just took off off the tops of the waves. And the Navy SEALs never caught up with it. Long story short, 4 of them drowned, which was the first and last time I ever heard of Navy SEALs drowning. They apparently, I don't know what the story was, but they never caught up with the raft, and the mission was a failure. So I went to the command post that night, and it was a pretty gloomy situation. We lost 4 men already, and we hadn't even started the mission. We still had to find out if we could land or if we were going to airdrop. That was the big decision. So I turned next to my combat controllers. These are Air Force guys. And this is the Zodiac, the type of thing that we were talking about. Combat controllers are very similar to SEALs, except that they were what was called in World War II pathfinders, and they would be dropped behind the lines to set up airdrop zones. They would be able to relay the weather to the aircraft. They would set up a beacon that we could home in on. This was before GPS really took effect. And I knew the commander of the combat control team. I'd been stationed with him at the Norton Air Force Base previously. He jumped out of my airplanes many times. He was a really reliable guy. He was a legend among the special forces. And I told him, I said, Dave, I want you to get on that runway and tell me whether we could land or not. And we have to know that 20 minutes before we get there so that they can hook up and either take off their parachutes or put them on or get prepared for an airdrop or an air land. Different configurations. So I got to know 20 minutes prior to HR. And he assured me that he would do that. He was going to parachute down onto a Navy ship and go ashore in the same way as the SEAL team and hopefully be more successful. And I marked that off my list of worries because I knew this guy was that reliable. So the mission was primarily going to be flown in 130s. We were going to put 56 troopers on board the 1st of the 75th Ranger Battalion from Fort Lewis, Washington. These men were having their briefings, and I went to their briefings. And in the meantime, I finally found somebody to scrounge up a flight suit for me so I could get out of civilian clothes and a set of general stars so I could get some things done around the base. And I went to all the Army briefings, and the last thing they said to me after they saw the drop zone was, don't drop us in the water. We're going to weigh 300 pounds, we'll drown. And I emphasized that to my guys. I said, if you cannot find that drop zone, we want you to abort because you're just signing these guys death warrant. You got to get them on that drop zone. And the problem was we didn't have much of an intelligence idea of what we were up against down there. And all of our assets, remember, this is the middle of the Cold War. Our intelligence assets and our attention was all in the middle of Eastern Europe and Russian Soviets and so forth. So we didn't much know what they had down there in the way of defenses or of what our opposing forces were to be. The idea was to set up the airplanes in a long stream of station keeping coming from 3 different airports in the U.S. Each plane had to be assigned a specific order in the drop. And on each plane, there was a sequence for who was going out first and what was going out last. The first 2 planes over the target zone would be runway clearing team in case they had obstacles on the runway and so forth. The third plane, which was the lead airplane to drop troops or to land, whatever the case may be, was the airplane I was going to be on. I had initially not planned on going on the mission, but the thing was deteriorating so fast, the confusion. You talk about the fog of war with all these different agencies pitching in The actual commander of the overall operation was stationed up in Virginia, and he was an Admiral named Metcalf. I never saw him or talked to him, but it came from him down through the Special Operations Command. And then under the Special Operations Command, the two-star was me. I was the air component commander. So I decided early on, I had two clipboards full of recalls and call signs and so forth, that I would have to go on this mission just to make sure. I was the only one that had made it to all the briefings. Most of my air crews were still planning the mission. We didn't even have maps of the area. I had to send one of our executive jets to all the different bases in Southeast U.S. to grab maps so that the crews could plan the mission. This is before GPS, remember, and crews were arriving from all over the country and just getting there in time to get in the airplane. They didn't know where we were going. They didn't know where Grenada was. It was, to throw a mission together like that in 48 hours was unbelievable. So I decided I better get with it and go with these guys. And I had all the information from all the briefings. I had all the contingency plans of the Army, and I was the only one that had that. The crew offered me the pilot seat, and I said, I'll just ride in the jump seat. I'll leave it up to you pros to do the airdrop or the air land, whatever it is. I was qualified in the 130, but that was a pretty shaky qualification as far as being proficient in the airplane. I was not. Okay, we're in the jump seat now, and we're ready. We had several delays. We wanted to make this drop or air land at night because of take advantage of our night vision technology. So that was critical to us. And we kept getting these delays as they added these different units and requirements. And we finally got that cut off. And we had all the airplanes out on the ramp assembled, and we saw all the troopers lined up, ready to get on the airplanes. We had an engine start time, and that was middle of the night. I think it was 2 o'clock in the morning or something, like 1 o'clock in the morning. And I noticed the troopers weren't getting on the airplane. We're getting ready to start. They were all lined up. I went outside and found the major in charge of one of the units. I said, what's going on? He said, we got a delay. There's a delay in our H hour. I said, that's not true. I know I've been to all the briefings. There's no delay. And we had a little argument out there on the ramp. And I assured him that we were going to take off at the certain designated time, which was 20 minutes from now. And you better be on that airplane or you're going to be sitting here watching the sun come up. And I went back on the airplane, and of course, he didn't know who I was. And got this ragtag flight suit on with 2 stars pinned on one shoulder. And he had been talking to his Army 2-star, and he wanted to hear it from him. And I said, no, he's on his way to one of the other bases to brief the crews on that, and he's not available. So you get on that airplane. And we finally convinced him and got out of there and headed our way down toward the island with several C-130s. And among them, we had the gunship, the AC-130, which was still in use today. It's a 105 millimeter cannon in the back, 40 millimeter cannon in the middle, and 2 20 millimeter cannons at the forward end. So it was a devastating weapon. We had 2 or 3 of those in the stream. They were to come in handy later on. This was a very accurate weapon from 10,000 feet. It had a radius of fire of about 100 feet, accuracy from 10,000 feet. So a very accurate, devastating weapon, and was very effective in Afghanistan. Here's a look at it from the front. You can see the big cannon sitting out the back, the 40 millimeter, and the 220s up front. So had that on board. This is the plane I was in. The MC-130. This had forward-looking infrared, and it had satellite secure radios. As we were going to go down there in complete radio silence because this was to be a surprise attack at nighttime, hopefully, and catch them totally off guard. The troopers would jump out of the side door in this type of configuration, and we would fly at 500 feet and 120 knots for the airdrop if that was the option we were to take. Now, the reason they wanted to do it 500 feet is because of this precarious drop zone, which I'll show you later, surrounded on 3 sides by water. One of the advantages of dropping at lower altitude, the winds will have less effect at driving them off the water. Also, you're exposed less to enemy fire, so it's a lot more effective But the one that disadvantage, you don't have use of your spare chutes. They normally jump with a chest pack and a backpack. So they leave the chest packs behind. They had only had one chute now to open. But that was a very critical decision that they made, and it turned out to be much the right decision, as you'll find out later on. We were briefed that there was one ZSU-23 on the island, and it was in the town squares, an exhibition of Soviet strength. These are 23 millimeter cannons, automatic. Some of them radar controlled, some not. We didn't know which they had down there. But our intelligence, again, was very weak because we were not focused on that area, and we didn't really know. It turned out there were 17 of these down there, and they were not radar controlled. They were visually controlled. But they were stationed all around the airport, too. There's another shot of the MC-130 that I was on. And we did have air refueling capability for about 10% of the fleet. So our plane was air refueled and a few of the other ones, but fuel was a critical issue. As we took off from the U.S. and went all the way down there, we would have time for about one pass over the island and then have to retreat back into Panama, closest alternate, for those that weren't refueled. The ones that were refueled had better options, but most of the fleet, fuel was very critical. As we went past Cuba, of course, they had Soviet MiGs, and we were a little worried about that. And there were F-15s at Panama that were on a strip alert in case we ran into any problem. But we went all the way down to radio silent, refueled, air refueled, radio silent, came all the way down, and the object was to make a pass over the runway, the length of the runway, and drop the troopers on if we had to, or land on the runway. All the way down here, I'm on a satellite radio trying to get a hold of my combat control team to see if they got on the island and find out if we could air land or air drop. I never heard from them. So I figured he must be a casualty. And I notified the commander in the back, the Army commander. I said, you're going to have to airdrop. It's going to be an airdrop. So everybody, 20 minutes out, got ready for the airdrop. Here's a look at the runway at Point Salinas Airport. This is from 3,000 feet. You can see the big lake up there in the left-hand corner. That was what was breaking up the runway and giving it problems, giving us that unknown factor of whether we could land or not. This is at low tide. When I saw the runway first, the waves were crashing up against the side of the runway around here. So it was truly looked like an aircraft carrier. This is a schematic of the runway. We were going to come in from this direction, fly out here and make a right turn out over the water again, and then climb back up to altitude. So that was the direction. We were going to a holding pattern here until 5 a.m. when the Marines were supposed to land, and we started across the runway, one at a time, streaming out the troopers. As we started our descent, and first of all, the weather was very bad. It was against us. We were in a holding pattern out here to the west of the airport, and we were stacked up, one plane on top of the other, doing racetrack patterns. And the weather was so bad, thunderstorms, we were bouncing into each other's airspace, and it was quite a fright. I thought we were going to have a mid-air collision out there. We finally reached the HR for the drop, and we started down. The first two airplanes were hit by lightning, lost all of their navigation equipment. This is the runway clearing teams. So I grabbed the commander and I said, you don't have a runway clearing team. You're going to drop in there by yourself. I'll get the rest of them in when I can. You still want to drop? He said, yes. So we started down to our descent level to 500 feet. And we got about a half mile off the end of the runway, and a huge aircraft searchlight lit up the cockpit from the ground. And I thought right then I knew we'd flown into a trap. They knew we were coming. Turns out the State Department had notified the Russians, the Soviets, to stay away from the airport at our age hour. So that blew our whole surprise thing. And nonetheless, we continued down here. As we got down to 500 feet, there were two ZSU-23 of those 20 millimeter cannons firing golf ball size things. They couldn't depress their guns enough to get down to 500 feet. They were depressed all the way. They're up on a hill, and we were flying underneath them. And as the door opened, the green light came on, and the troopers started bailing out. I could see their faces lighting up with this anti-aircraft fire. I didn't know they were firing over us. I couldn't tell, but they're all kind of small arms fire from the ground coming up. It was an intense anti-aircraft fire, and the troopers were jumping out all along the runway. Then we spread them out. We made a right turn, and at that time headed straight for the water. I thought we were hit. We went down to about 50 feet. Commander was trying to avoid the anti-aircraft. And as we flew out over here, then we climbed up to sit on a perch to watch the rest of the operation. For a while, we had the commander and his group on the ground. And once it dropped from my airplane, they were surrounded, pinned down by fire in the middle of the runway. Planes behind us aborted the run because of the anti-aircraft fire. About that time, as our troops hit the ground, we called in the gunship, and the cavalry came to our rescue. He had watched the whole thing from his perch at 10,000 feet, and he said, "I know where those gun sights are. Am I cleared?" I said, "Yes." He came in and took out the guns, the ZS-23 things. He also took out a truckload of troops that was coming in the road toward the airport to engage our troops on the ground. So for a long period of time, we had this one unit surrounded on the ground, and we finally got the guns put out of commission. The rest of the formation started making their drops one at a time, crossing over the runway, dropping out the paratroops. And about 4 or 5 airplanes later, they started to clear the runway, and they had enough people on the ground to do the job. And one of the things they found was that in addition to knowing we were coming and preparing the searchlight and the guns, they had put 50-gallon drum cement cans at the end of the runway, so that if we tried to land, we'd be balled up in a pile of trash, because they had barbed wire and all kind of obstacles in the landing zone of the runway. The decision to fly at 500 feet saved us from those guns on the hill, and the decision to airdrop saved us from a catastrophe on the ground if we'd have tried to land on that runway. Eventually got the runway cleared, and the next morning, this young lady was selling T-shirts. That's how quickly they adjusted to Americans coming. And we lost 19 killed in taking the island of Grenada. We rescued all of the students. None of them was injured. Here's a picture of one of the students up at Charleston where they landed with some of them. Happy to be saved by the Americans. And I ended up at Panama and got my first sleep in something like 30 hours for about an hour. And they woke me up and said, "You want to flight back we can get you back to the States." And I flew into Charlotte, North Carolina. And the wife by that time had made it back to our home station in Illinois. And I was waiting for a commercial plane in the terminal. And the guy next to me opened up the newspaper and he said, "Wow," he said, "look at this." He said, "Isn't that something?" I said, "Yep, it sure was." And he looked at me like I was nuts. But in any event, we eventually got in there, cleaned out the mess. They found Bulgarians, Russians, Cubans, the usual North Koreans, the usual gang of suspects. They rounded them all up, as well as the Grenadian army. They deported all those Eastern Europeans back to their country. 60 days we were out of there. The island is still a parliamentary democracy today, and the medical school has resumed training American medical students. What happened to my combat control team, the guys that were going to get on the runway and tell me what happened? Their boat got swamped. Their motors were stalled. They used their rifles to paddle. They got around to the edge of the runway and saw us flying over and waved to us. And they ended up here west of the island with the currents, and eventually were rescued by our own rescue service. Some of the aftermath, as I said, 19 killed in action. Clint Eastwood made a movie about it, Heartbreak Ridge. Wasn't very accurate. It depicted the Marines as saving the students, but the Marines didn't do that. The Army did. It was the Marines, unfortunately, were dumped off in a mangrove swamp and had a pretty tough time of it with the elements. It was called The Day the Evil Empire Retreated, and Wall Street Journal had this statement: the Cold War began to end 35 years ago when Ronald Reagan ordered the liberation of Grenada. That was the peak of the communist influence, and the Berlin Wall came down. Ted Cruz called it the last war we won, and as I say, it's still a democracy today. I close with this with all the students. I give them something to think about, and that's my story.